November the 10th, 1982. Moscow is cold, grey and very still. The body of Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev lies in state inside the Hall of Columns, surrounded by flowers that will wilt before anyone admits what they are really feeling. 3 days later, the funeral procession moves across Red Square with the slow, mechanical precision that the Soviet state had always performed so well. Military bands, rows of medals on velvet cushions, generals with stone faces. The coffin is lowered, and somewhere in the crowd of dignitaries, if you watch closely enough, you can see something that does not quite look like grief. It looks more like relief. An era had ended, 18 years of one man's grip on the largest country on earth. And the question that hung over that frozen square, unspoken but impossible to ignore, was the same question that historians and ordinary people would keep asking for decades afterward. Who, exactly, was this man?
What was he beneath the medals and the slogans and the carefully managed image? The official answer was simple. The propaganda machine had spent nearly 2 decades constructing it. Brezhnev was a modest son of the working class, a loyal Leninist, a man of the people who had risen through honest service to lead his country toward a bright communist future. That was the version printed in textbooks, broadcast on state television, and repeated in factories and schools across 11 time zones. The archives tell a different story. Leonid Brezhnev was born in 1906 in Kamenskoye, a small industrial town in what is now Ukraine. His father worked in a steel mill. The family was not wealthy, and for a long time, the official biography was not entirely wrong about that part. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. The boy from the steel town developed a taste for things that steel towns do not produce. Fine clothes, fast cars, the feeling of being watched and admired. Whether that hunger was always there, buried beneath the surface of a working-class childhood, or whether it grew slowly as power accumulated around him, is something the archives cannot fully answer. What they can tell us is that by the time Brezhnev reached the top, the appetite had become extraordinary. The residence at Zaresh, outside Moscow, was not a home in any ordinary sense. It was a compound. Forests, a private lake, a shooting range, a cinema hall, a fleet of vehicles, and a staff of dozens whose sole purpose was to ensure that the General Secretary never encountered anything inconvenient or uncomfortable. Western journalists who occasionally caught glimpses of Soviet elite life through diplomatic channels described something that bore no resemblance to the grey austerity that ordinary Soviet citizens lived inside. The contrast was not incidental, it was structural. The system had been built, layer by layer, to insulate its leaders from the reality they governed. Nothing illustrated that gap quite as vividly as the cars. By the time Brezhnev died, his personal collection numbered more than 60 vehicles. Not Soviet-made Volgas or Zils, though those were there too. The real prizes were the foreign ones. A Lincoln Continental from Richard Nixon, a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, a Mercedes-Benz from Willy Brandt, a Citroën Maserati from Georges Pompidou. World leaders had learned, apparently, that the fastest way to Brezhnev's goodwill ran through his garage. He drove them himself, which was the part that made his security detail quietly desperate. He drove fast, with the confidence of a man who believed that consequences applied to other people. In January of 1969, that confidence nearly killed him. A gunman opened fire on a motorcade near the Kremlin, and Brezhnev's car was hit. He survived, but the physical and psychological effects of that day lingered. His health, which had never been robust, began a long and complicated decline. And yet the cars remained. The speed remained. Some appetites, it seems, are stronger than fear. The hunting was another chapter entirely. Brezhnev's hunts at the Zavidovo Reserve were not quiet, solitary affairs. They were productions. Hundreds of animals were driven toward the shooting positions by teams of beaters. The General Secretary would arrive by helicopter, take his shots, and depart. Witnesses who spoke about these events only after the Soviet Union had collapsed described something closer to a slaughter than a sport. The numbers were staggering, the logistics were military, and the whole operation was, of course, completely invisible to the Soviet public, who were, at that same moment, standing in queues for basic food items. The wardrobe ran to more than 200 suits, tailored, maintained, catalogued. Brezhnev paid attention to how he looked in a way that was unusual for Soviet leaders, who had traditionally cultivated an image of austere functionality. He liked good fabric. He liked a well-cut jacket. He liked, in short, the things that money and power could buy. And he had both in quantities that no Soviet citizen could have imagined. All of this, every car and every tailored suit and every hunting lodge, existed in a parallel world. A world that ran alongside the Soviet Union that ordinary people inhabited but never touched it. In the shops of Moscow and Leningrad and Novosibirsk, the shelves were often bare. Meat was rationed. Imported goods were fantasies. The gap between what the leadership consumed and what the population could access was not exactly a secret, but it was a truth the system worked very hard to keep out of focus. State media showed Brezhnev in carefully staged settings, visiting factories, greeting workers, signing documents. The compound, the garage, the hunting lodge, the 200-suit wardrobe, none of that appeared on the evening news. What the propaganda constructed was a figure of almost deliberate ordinariness, a man who had come from nothing, served his country faithfully, and now led it with steady, experienced hands. The image was not entirely fabricated. Brezhnev had served in the war. He had worked his way up through the party apparatus over decades. He was not, by the standards of Soviet leadership, a monster. He did not send millions to the camps. He did not order mass executions. Compared to what had come before him, his rule was, in a certain grim sense, almost comfortable. But comfort, it turns out, has its own corruption, and the man who presided over that comfort, who enjoyed it in quantities that would have seemed obscene to the people he governed, was not the modest Leninist of the textbooks. He was something more complicated, more human, and in some ways more troubling. A man who had learned to want, and who had found himself in a position where wanting had no limits. The luxury was real. The appetite was real. And behind both of them, behind the cars and the medals and the hunting lodges and the tailored suits, was a political intelligence that should not be underestimated. Because Brezhnev did not stumble into power. He did not inherit it. He took it, carefully and deliberately, from a man who never saw it coming. And that story, the story of how Leonid Brezhnev became the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, is one of the most coldly calculated political operations of the 20th century. The autumn of 1964 was, on the surface, unremarkable. The Soviet Union was functioning. The harvests had been poor, but harvests were often poor. The Cuban Missile Crisis had passed 2 years earlier, leaving the world shaken but intact. Nikita Khrushchev, the man who had denounced Stalin, survived the purges and clawed his way to the top of the most dangerous political system in human history, was resting at his dacha on the Black Sea. He had no particular reason to feel afraid. He had survived everything. And the man he trusted most, the one he had personally elevated and brought along through the years, was a broad-shouldered, heavy-browed party official from Dnepropetrovsk named Leonid Brezhnev. Khrushchev considered Brezhnev loyal. He considered him manageable. He considered him, if the accounts of people who knew both men are to be believed, not entirely serious. That assessment would turn out to be one of the most consequential misjudgments in Soviet history. What Khrushchev did not know, or perhaps could not bring himself to believe, was that the conversations had been going on for at least 2 years. Not loud conversations, not the kind that leave traces in official records. Quiet ones, careful ones. The kind that happen in the margins of party gatherings, in the back rooms of government buildings, in the brief, private moments that senior officials create for themselves when they need to say something that cannot be said anywhere else. According to accounts that emerged after the Soviet Union collapsed, including testimony from participants who had little reason left to lie, the first serious discussions about removing Khrushchev began as early as 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been the trigger, not because the crisis itself had been a catastrophe, but because of how Khrushchev had handled it. Impulsively, unilaterally, without consulting the people around him. He had brought the world to the edge of nuclear war and then back down in a way that looked, to the men watching from inside the Kremlin, like humiliation. The military was furious. The party apparatus was unsettled, and a small group of senior officials began, very quietly, to ask a question that was technically treasonous to even think. What would it take to get rid of him? The names that appear in the accounts of this period are significant. Alexander Shepilov, the former KGB chief, was among the most aggressive voices. Vladimir Semichastny, who had taken over the KGB from Shepilov, was another. Both men, according to their own later recollections, were willing to consider options that went considerably beyond a political vote. They discussed, at least in the abstract, whether Khrushchev might be removed by other means. An aircraft malfunction, a sudden illness, the kind of accident that the Soviet security apparatus had, over the decades, demonstrated a certain expertise in arranging. Whether these discussions were serious proposals or the dark speculation of frightened men is something the historical record cannot fully resolve. What is clear is that they happened. And what is equally clear is that Brezhnev, who moved in the same circles where these conversations took place, did not stop them. The question of exactly what role Brezhnev played in the most radical proposals is one that historians have approached with care. He was not, by temperament, a man who liked blood. He was a political operator, not an executioner. The evidence suggests that he understood the value of the more extreme voices in the room without necessarily endorsing what they were saying. He let Shepilov and Semichastny push the boundaries. He let others carry the risk of the most dangerous ideas. And when the moment came to pull back from the edge and choose a cleaner path, he was positioned as the reasonable man. The moderate, the one who had kept his head. It was, if this reconstruction holds, a masterclass in political survival. The coalition that eventually formed around the plan to remove Khrushchev was broader than it might appear. Alexei Kosygin, the technocrat who would become prime minister, was involved. Nikolai Podgorny, who would later serve as the nominal head of state, was part of the group. Mikhail Suslov, the grey ideological enforcer of the party, lent his weight to the effort. These were not radicals. These were the careful men, the ones who had survived by never moving too fast or too far. Their presence in the conspiracy was a signal that the operation had moved from dangerous fantasy into something deliberate. The compromise they reached was elegant in its simplicity. No accidents, no illness, no aircraft going down over the Urals. The removal would be political. Khrushchev would be confronted by the full weight of the Presidium, presented with a catalogue of failures, and given the opportunity to resign. The genius of the plan was that it required Khrushchev to cooperate in his own removal, and for that to work, he could not see it coming. He was recalled from his Black Sea holiday in October of 1964 under the pretext of an agricultural meeting. It was the kind of summons he had received dozens of times. There was nothing in the wording, nothing in the tone that would have suggested anything unusual. He flew back to Moscow, he walked into the meeting, and then the room closed around him. The session of the Presidium that followed has been described by participants as one of the most extraordinary political confrontations in Soviet history. One by one, the men Khrushchev had trusted, promoted, and in some cases saved from earlier purges, stood up and delivered their indictments. The agricultural failures, the foreign policy humiliations, the erratic decision-making, the cult of personality that Khrushchev himself had denounced in Stalin and then quietly constructed around himself. The charges were real enough. The performance was devastating. Khrushchev, by the accounts of those present, was shaken in a way that few had ever seen. He had survived Stalin, he had survived the anti-party group, but he had never faced this, the unanimous, coordinated withdrawal of support from every person in the room. He tried to argue, he tried to appeal, and then something in him gave way. He signed the resignation. He was driven home, and Leonid Brezhnev, the man Khrushchev had considered manageable, became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The speech Brezhnev delivered in the aftermath was not the speech of a man who felt gratitude or relief. It was precise and cold. It catalogued Khrushchev's failures with the efficiency of a prosecutor who has already won his case and is simply completing the paperwork. People who heard it and later spoke about it described a quality in Brezhnev's voice that they had not noticed before. A hardness, a certainty. The performance of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment and had no intention of wasting it. What followed the removal was in some ways more revealing than the removal itself. Khrushchev was not imprisoned. He was not shot. He was given a pension, a dacha, and a security detail that was, depending on how you looked at it, either a courtesy or a cage. His telephone calls were monitored. His visitors were noted. The men who had removed him were not cruel, but they were not careless either. A former General Secretary who was alive and talking represented a certain kind of risk, and the new leadership managed that risk with the same quiet efficiency it had applied to everything else. Khrushchev spent his final years dictating his memoirs onto tape, a project that the KGB was aware of and deeply unhappy about. He died in September of 1971. The official cause was heart failure. He was 77 years old, and his health had been declining for some time, so the explanation was medically plausible. But the circumstances have never been entirely free of questions. No autopsy results were ever made public. The cremation was handled with a speed that struck some observers as unusual. The state funeral that a former leader might have expected was not provided. Whether there is anything more to the story than an old man dying of a worn-out heart is something the available evidence cannot confirm. It is possible, and perhaps even likely, that Khrushchev simply died. It is also possible that the men who had removed him found it convenient that he did not live to see his memoirs published in the West, which they were the following year. The truth, in all probability, belongs to a category of Soviet history that will never be fully recovered. There is a particular irony that sits at the center of this entire story. Brezhnev came to power on the back of a movement that defined itself, at least in part, as a correction to the excesses of one-man rule. The presidium that removed Khrushchev was united, among other things, by a shared revulsion at the way he had concentrated authority in his own hands and built a public image that bordered on a cult. They were, in their own telling, restoring collective leadership. And Brezhnev, who had organized the operation that made all of this possible, presented himself as the embodiment of that correction. Within a few years, he had accumulated more personal power than Khrushchev had ever held. The cult of personality that the conspirators had denounced would, under Brezhnev, reach dimensions that would have seemed almost satirical if they had not been entirely real. The man who came to power promising less became the man who demanded more. But before the medals and the ghost-written memoirs, and the elaborate rituals of power that would come to define his rule, there was something else, something quieter and more personal. A physical reality that the propaganda machine worked very hard to conceal, and that the Soviet public noticed anyway, in the particular way that people notice things they are not supposed to see. There are things that power cannot fix. It can build palaces and fill garages and stock hunting lodges with enough game to last a lifetime. It can silence critics, rewrite history, and ensure that the evening news shows exactly what you want it to show. But it cannot fix a man's teeth. And for Leonid Brezhnev, that particular limitation turned out to matter more than almost anyone outside the innermost circle of Soviet power ever knew. The problem had roots that went back further than his time at the top. People who knew Brezhnev in his earlier years, before the dachas and the motorcades and the state banquets, described a man who was already self-conscious about his mouth. Whether the underlying condition was genetic or simply the result of the kind of dental neglect that was normal for a boy growing up in a working-class industrial town in the 1910s and 20s is not something the record makes entirely clear. What is clear is that by the time he reached genuine political prominence in the 1960s, the deterioration was serious. Periodontal disease had taken hold, teeth were being lost. The pain, according to accounts from people close to him at the time, was at certain points significant enough to affect his concentration and his mood. His personal physician, Yevgeny Chazov, who later wrote with unusual candor about the health of Soviet leaders, described a man with a deep and genuine fear of dental treatment. Not the mild discomfort that most people feel when they think about sitting in a dentist's chair, but something closer to dread. Each appointment, by Chazov's account, was a negotiation. Brezhnev would delay, find reasons to postpone, and when the visit could no longer be avoided, he would arrive in a state of visible tension that his staff found difficult to manage. For a man who had sat across the table from Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon without flinching, the dentist's chair represented a particular kind of vulnerability he could not seem to master. The solution eventually settled on was the one that dental medicine offered at the time: removable dentures. Fitted and refitted over the years as the underlying bone structure continued to change. They were made by the best technicians available to the Soviet medical establishment, which meant they were considerably better than what an ordinary Soviet citizen could have accessed. But even the best dentures of that era were imperfect instruments. They shifted, they clicked, they changed the way a person spoke in ways that were subtle enough to be deniable, but obvious enough to be noticed. And for a man whose public role required him to speak constantly in front of cameras and microphones and rooms full of foreign dignitaries, the implications were significant. The 24th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union took place in the spring of 1971. It was a major event by any measure. Thousands of delegates, extensive foreign press coverage, hours of speeches broadcast across the country. Brezhnev delivered the central report as General Secretary. Somewhere in the middle of it, something went wrong. The accounts of exactly what happened vary in their details, as accounts of embarrassing moments involving powerful people tend to do. But the broad outline is consistent across multiple sources. The denture shifted. The speech became difficult to follow. There was a pause, a brief interruption in the broadcast, and then the address continued. Whether the interruption was long enough for the audience in the hall to fully register what had happened is something the available record does not resolve with certainty. What is certain is that the technical team responsible for the broadcast understood immediately that something had occurred that needed to be managed. Outside the hall, among the population watching on television, the reaction was the one that Soviet authorities had learned to dread most. Not outrage, not protest, but jokes. The Soviet Union had a rich tradition of political humor that functioned as a kind of underground pressure valve, and Brezhnev's speech patterns had already been generating material for years. His voice had a particular quality, a heaviness in the consonants, a slight slurring of certain sounds that impressionists and ordinary people alike had quietly mimicked. The Congress incident simply added another layer to a body of popular observation that the propaganda apparatus could suppress in official media, but could not erase from private conversation. The physical consequences extended beyond public appearances. The elaborate meals that were a feature of Kremlin hospitality, the roasted meats and crusty breads and harder foods that a man of his appetites might have enjoyed, became increasingly difficult to manage. A special menu was developed, weighted towards softer preparations. People who attended state dinners with him in his later years described a careful management of what was placed in front of him, invisible to most guests, but obvious to those who knew what to look for. By the late 1970s, the dental problems had become entangled with a broader pattern of physical decline that was itself becoming a political issue of the first order. Infections required courses of antibiotics. Inflammation affected his energy and his clarity. The medications prescribed to manage one condition interacted with those prescribed to manage others. Chazov and the team of physicians responsible for Brezhnev's health were, by this point, managing a situation of considerable complexity. And the decisions they made would have consequences that went well beyond one man's comfort. The propaganda apparatus responded with the tools it had always used: control of the image. Photographs were selected with care. The ones that showed him with his mouth open or at an angle that emphasized the changes in his facial structure did not make it into the official record. Camera operators who filmed him at official events understood, without being told explicitly, which angles were acceptable and which were not. The result was a public image that was, in its way, a small masterpiece of selective presentation. Millions of Soviet citizens saw Brezhnev regularly on their television screens without ever quite seeing him. They saw a version of him, carefully curated, from which the most visible signs of his physical reality had been quietly removed. And yet people noticed, not because they had access to classified medical files, but because they had eyes and ears. The speech patterns were there in every broadcast. The slight hesitation before certain words, the way some sounds came out differently than they should have, the jokes that circulated in kitchens and courtyards and factory break rooms were not simply cruel, they were something more complicated, a kind of wry, collective acknowledgement that the man on the television was not entirely what he was presented as being. There was a psychological dimension to all of this worth considering. Brezhnev was, by multiple accounts, a man who cared deeply about how he appeared. The 200 suits, the attention to his public presentation, the discomfort he felt when things did not go as planned in front of an audience. These were not the traits of someone indifferent to perception. The dental situation, which he could not fully control and could not fully conceal, represented a persistent source of anxiety in a man who had built his entire public existence on the management of appearances. People who interacted with him in smaller settings have described a certain guardedness that was not present in his earlier years, a reluctance to get too close, a preference for arrangements that kept a certain physical distance between himself and the people he was meeting. Whether this was a direct response to the dental situation or simply the natural withdrawal of an aging and increasingly unwell man is impossible to say with certainty. But the pattern is consistent enough across enough accounts to suggest that the private discomfort had found its way into the public behavior. The deeper irony is the metaphorical weight the situation carries. A man whose public role required him to speak for a nation, to articulate its direction and its values and its place in the world, was struggling with the most basic mechanics of speech. A system that presented itself as healthy and strong was being led by someone whose body was quietly telling a different story. The Soviet Union of the 1970s was, in ways that would only become fully visible later, a system with structural problems that were being managed rather than solved. The economy was being sustained by oil revenues that masked deeper dysfunctions. The political culture had calcified into rituals that everyone performed and no one quite believed. And at the center of all of it, Delivering the speeches and receiving the foreign dignitaries was a man who was himself a living embodiment of that gap. The image carefully maintained, the reality carefully hidden. The performance continuing long after the performance had become the only thing left. The dental problems were, in the end, a small thing, a private inconvenience, a source of personal embarrassment, a logistical challenge for the people managing his public appearances. But small things, when they belong to the most powerful man in the largest country on earth, have a way of casting long shadows. And the shadow this one cast pointed towards something larger, a system that had learned to hide its decay so well that it had almost forgotten the decay was there. Almost, because there were other things that could not be hidden quite so easily, other excesses, other performances that were becoming harder and harder to sustain. The medals were one of them. By the time Brezhnev's health had become a matter of quiet crisis management inside the Kremlin, the collection of honours he had accumulated had reached dimensions that were, even by the standards of Soviet political culture, genuinely difficult to explain. There is a photograph that became, in its own strange way, one of the defining images of the Cold War. It shows Brezhnev at a formal ceremony, standing in full dress uniform, his chest covered from collar to waist in a dense, almost architectural arrangement of medals, orders, and decorations. The effect is not quite military, it is something closer to geological, layer upon layer of accumulated metal, each piece representing a moment when someone, somewhere, had decided that Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev deserved to be honoured. By the end of his life, those moments numbered more than 200. The weight of the full collection, when worn together on formal occasions, was estimated at around 3 kilograms. The engineering required to keep it all attached to a single jacket without tearing the fabric was, by accounts of the tailors and aides responsible for managing it, a genuine technical challenge. A special reinforced lining had been developed. Dressing for a major state occasion could take the better part of an hour. And through all of it, Brezhnev would stand with the patience of a man who considered this entirely reasonable. The beginning, it should be said, was not absurd. Brezhnev had served in the Second World War, and the decorations he received during that period were legitimate by any standard. He had been a political officer, working in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, and the medals from those years represented something real. The Order of the Red Star, the Order of the Red Banner, combat decorations earned in a war that killed tens of millions of Soviet citizens. No serious historian disputes the basic fact of his wartime service. The problem was what came after. Once Brezhnev consolidated power in the late 1960s, the flow of honours did not slow down, it accelerated. The Soviet system had always used awards as a tool of political management, a way of binding loyalty and signalling favour. And Brezhnev understood this mechanism with the instinctive fluency of a man who had spent his entire adult life inside it. But understanding a mechanism and being consumed by it are different things, and somewhere along the way, the line between the two became very difficult to locate. The 4 gold stars of Hero of the Soviet Union were the centerpiece of the collection and the most discussed. The first had come in 1966, tied to his wartime service, which was at least arguable on its merits. The second, third, and fourth arrived in 1976, 1978, and 1981 respectively, each one attached to a birthday or a significant anniversary, each one awarded in peacetime by a system that was, in effect, honouring itself. The Hero of the Soviet Union designation had been created to recognise extraordinary acts of courage, typically in combat. It had been given to pilots who flew impossible missions, to soldiers who held positions against overwhelming odds. Awarding it 4 times to the leader of a country that was not at war, for reasons the official citations described in language of magnificent vagueness, required a certain institutional willingness to pretend. The Soviet establishment, by the late 1970s, had developed that willingness to a considerable degree. The Order of Victory was a different matter, and the story of how Brezhnev came to receive it in 1978 is one of the more revealing episodes of the entire period. The Order of Victory was the highest military decoration in the Soviet system, created during the Second World War and awarded, in its original conception, only to supreme commanders who had successfully directed major strategic operations. Stalin had received it, Zhukov had received it, Rokossovsky had received it, the men who had actually won the war. When the proposal to award it to Brezhnev was raised, the reaction among senior military leadership was, according to accounts that emerged later, something between discomfort and quiet outrage. Marshal Dmitry Ustinov, who was both defense minister and a close ally of Brezhnev, reportedly attempted to dissuade him. The argument, as it has been reconstructed from various sources, was essentially practical. The award would invite ridicule, it would diminish the decoration itself, and it would invite a comparison with genuine wartime commanders that Brezhnev could not survive. Brezhnev, by the accounts of people present in those discussions, listened and declined to be persuaded. The Order of Victory was awarded at a ceremony in February of 1978. The reaction among surviving veterans of the actual war was not recorded in any official document. It did not need to be. The foreign decorations added another dimension. Governments around the world had learned, as the card owners had learned before them, that Brezhnev responded warmly to gestures of this kind. Orders and medals arrived from across the socialist bloc, from non-aligned nations, from countries whose relationships with the Soviet Union were complicated enough that a well-chosen decoration could serve as useful diplomatic currency. Henry Kissinger, who had dealt with Brezhnev across the negotiating tables of détente and developed a complex, wary respect for him, was said to have regarded the medal collection with the expression of a man confronting a problem he had not expected to encounter. Whether the specific remark attributed to him in various retellings is accurate is impossible to verify at this distance. What is not in doubt is that foreign dignitaries attending formal ceremonies with Brezhnev in his later years were confronted with a visual spectacle that required some adjustment. The effect on the broader political culture was perhaps the collection's most significant consequence. Brezhnev's appetite for honours did not remain a personal eccentricity, it spread. The Politburo, the Central Committee, the senior apparatus of the Soviet state, all of them began participating in a system of mutual decoration that, by the early 1980s, had taken on the quality of a ritual divorced from any original meaning. Awards were exchanged at birthdays, at anniversaries, at the conclusion of meetings that had accomplished nothing in particular. The orders and medals that had once been reserved for genuine achievement became the currency of a system rewarding itself for continuing to exist. When everything is honoured, nothing is. After Brezhnev's death, the reassessment was swift in some areas and slower in others. The Order of Victory was formally revoked by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1989 on the grounds that its original statutes had never permitted its award to anyone other than supreme commanders in active wartime operations. It was a small gesture, but a pointed one. The medals were one face of the imitation. The books were another, and in some ways the more revealing one, because the books required not just the compliance of a system, but the active participation of a man who had, somewhere along the way, come to believe something about himself that was not true. The trilogy that appeared under Brezhnev's name between 1978 and 1979, 3 slim volumes titled Malaya Zemlya, Rebirth and Virgin Lands, was presented to the Soviet public as the literary memoir of a statesman reflecting on the defining experiences of his life. The first volume dealt with his wartime service near Novorossiysk. The second covered the post-war reconstruction period. The third addressed the agricultural campaigns in Kazakhstan in the 1950s. The books were not written by Brezhnev. This was understood, at the time, by essentially everyone in the Soviet Union who thought about it for more than a moment. The actual writing was done by a team of journalists and professional writers, who worked from interviews, archival materials, and careful political guidance that ensured the final product would say exactly what it needed to say. Brezhnev's actual involvement in the writing process was, by the accounts of people who worked on or around the project, minimal in the technical sense. He did not sit at a desk and compose sentences. What he did, apparently, was talk. He talked about his memories, his experiences, his sense of what had happened and why it mattered. The writers took what he gave them and shaped it into something publishable. The Novorossiysk material was the most politically sensitive because it touched on events that living veterans remembered. The battle for the Malaya Zemlya beachhead in 1943 had been a genuine and brutal engagement, and Brezhnev had been present as a political officer. His role had been real, if not the central one the book implied. The gap between what the memoir described and what veterans of the same campaign recalled was wide enough to generate, in the underground economy of Soviet private conversation, a considerable amount of bitter commentary. Men who had fought in the same place found themselves in the position of having their own memories contradicted by a book the state was now treating as authoritative. The books entered the school curriculum. Students were assigned essays on them. Teachers who had spent careers developing genuine literary and historical knowledge were required to treat these slim volumes with the same seriousness they gave to Tolstoy. The humiliation was quiet, professional, and entirely understood by everyone involved. The print run reached 15 million copies across the 3 volumes, a figure achieved not through demand, but through the mechanisms of a system that could direct publishing resources wherever it chose. In 1979, Brezhnev was awarded the Lenin Prize for Literature. The Lenin Prize was the highest literary honor in the Soviet Union. It had been given to writers of genuine distinction, to poets whose work had survived decades and would survive decades more. Adding Brezhnev's name to that list required the Soviet cultural establishment to perform a particular kind of collective pretense, and the establishment performed it without visible difficulty. What made the literary episode genuinely strange, and what separates it from simple cynicism, is the evidence that Brezhnev himself came to believe in it. People close to him in his final years described a man who spoke about the books with a pride that did not seem entirely performed. He had absorbed the myth constructed around him so thoroughly that the construction had become, in his own experience, indistinguishable from reality. He had been told repeatedly, and by people whose job it was to tell him things, that he was a significant writer. And he had, in the way that human beings tend to do when told something often enough by enough people, come to accept it as true. The books vanished almost immediately after his death. Not gradually, not through the slow process by which unfashionable literature fades from circulation, but quickly, with the efficiency of a system reversing a decision it had never quite believed in. Libraries quietly removed them. Schools dropped them from curricula. The 15 million copies found their way, in significant numbers, to the paper recycling collections that Soviet citizens were periodically encouraged to participate in. The speed of the disappearance was itself a kind of verdict. The medals and the books, taken together, point towards something worth sitting with. They were not simply the vanity of one man, though they were certainly that. They were the product of a system that had learned to generate the appearance of achievement in place of achievement itself, to substitute the performance of greatness for anything greatness might actually require. The medals said, "This man has done extraordinary things." The books said, "This man has thought extraordinary thoughts." Neither claim could survive serious examination. Both were maintained for years by the full weight of a state apparatus that had more pressing reasons to sustain the fiction than to correct it. The private man behind the medals and the ghost-written pages was, in some ways, more interesting than either, because Brezhnev was not simply a passive recipient of a system's flattery.
He was a man with genuine appetites, genuine relationships, and a private life that bore almost no resemblance to the public image the propaganda had constructed.
And the most visible expression of that private life, the one that would become as iconic as the medals themselves, was something far more intimate than any decoration. It was the way he greeted people, the way he held them, the way he pressed his lips to their faces in a gesture that was, depending on who was receiving it, an honor, an obligation, or something that required a very particular kind of diplomatic composure to endure. There is a photograph that most people who lived through the Cold War will recognize the moment they see it. Two men in dark suits standing close together on a public stage, their faces pressed together in a full kiss on the lips. One of them is Erich Honecker, the General Secretary of East Germany. The other is Leonid Brezhnev. The image was taken in 1979 during the 30th anniversary celebrations of the German Democratic Republic, and it became one of the most reproduced political photographs of the entire era. It was painted as a mural on the Berlin Wall. It appeared in newspapers across the world. It was discussed, analyzed, and eventually absorbed into the visual vocabulary of the 20th century as a symbol of something, though people disagreed about exactly what. What it actually was, stripped of the layers of retrospective irony, was a ritual. A very specific, very deliberate ritual that Brezhnev had developed over the course of his years in power and elevated into something approaching a formal instrument of Soviet diplomacy. The kiss was not spontaneous. It was not, in the Soviet political context, a personal gesture in any ordinary sense. It was a signal, a classification, a statement about where a person stood in relation to the center of Soviet power. To be kissed by Brezhnev, in the full ceremonial sense, was to be marked as belonging to the inner circle. To receive something less was to understand your position in a hierarchy that did not need to be spoken aloud to be perfectly clear. The tradition of greeting with a kiss had roots in Russian and Soviet culture that predated Brezhnev by centuries. But what he did with it was something different. He systematized it. He made it legible. He turned a cultural habit into a political grammar that every leader in the socialist world learned to read with the same attention they gave to any other signal from Moscow. The hierarchy was precise. A full kiss on the lips, held for a moment, accompanied by a firm embrace. This was the highest register, reserved for the closest allies, the most trusted partners. A kiss on both cheeks, warm but slightly less intimate, appropriate for reliable friends who were not quite in the innermost circle. A single cheek, a brief touch, cordial, functional. And then the gradations below that. The handshake that was slightly too brief, the eye contact that did not quite hold, the positioning of the body that communicated, without a word being spoken, that something had changed. Alexander Dubček understood this grammar in a way that was, for him, personally devastating. Before the Prague Spring of 1968, Dubček and Brezhnev had met with the warmth of men who considered themselves genuine comrades. After the Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia in August of that year, after Dubček was removed from power and the reforms he had championed were systematically dismantled, the physical language between the two men changed completely. Accounts from people present at subsequent encounters describe Brezhnev's manner toward Dubček as something that went beyond coldness. It was a kind of deliberate erasure. The man who had been greeted as a brother was now treated as someone who had ceased, in any meaningful sense, to exist. Whether Brezhnev refused to shake his hand on specific occasions, as some accounts suggest, or whether the withdrawal was more subtle, is something the historical record does not resolve with complete precision. What is consistent across multiple sources is the quality of the distance, absolute, intentional, and understood by everyone present as a verdict. The Western leaders who encountered the kissing ritual had to navigate it with varying degrees of success. Jimmy Carter, who met Brezhnev at the Vienna summit in 1979, was by several accounts visibly startled by the physical directness of the greeting. Willy Brandt, the West German Chancellor whose Ostpolitik had made him one of the Western leaders most invested in a functional relationship with Moscow, approached the ritual with what people who knew him described as philosophical acceptance. Brandt understood that the relationship with the Soviet Union required a willingness to operate inside frameworks that were not entirely comfortable. The kiss was one of those frameworks. He accepted it as the price of doing business. Inside the Soviet system, the ritual had its own internal politics. Politburo meetings began with a greeting sequence that could consume a significant portion of the available time. 15 men, each of whom needed to be greeted in a manner appropriate to his current standing, each greeting carrying its own freight of political information. Who received what kind of greeting? Who was held a moment longer? Who got a slightly cooler reception than the last time? These were the signals that told the men in the room where they stood and what they needed to think about. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the legendary commander who had done more than almost any other individual to win the Second World War, had a different relationship with physical deference than most of the men in Brezhnev's circle. The accounts of his interactions with Brezhnev suggest a friction that went beyond simple personality difference. Whether Zhukov's resistance to the full performance of the greeting ritual was a deliberate statement or simply the natural behavior of a man who had never learned to perform submission is something the sources do not fully clarify. What is clear is that the friction had consequences, and that Zhukov spent the Brezhnev years at a considerable distance from the centers of power. By the late 1970s, the ritual had acquired a quality that several people close to Brezhnev described with careful delicacy. His health was declining in ways that made sustained physical contact increasingly uncomfortable. The medications he was taking affected his coordination and his energy. The elaborate embrace that had once been a genuine expression of political intent had become, for the man performing it, something that required visible effort. And yet, no one in the circle around him was in a position to suggest that the ritual be modified. The system Brezhnev had built around himself was one in which his preferences could not be questioned. So the kisses continued. The last significant public one, by the accounts of people who tracked these things, was the one Brezhnev gave to Yuri Andropov at a ceremony held just days before Brezhnev's death in November of 1982. Andropov received it with the composure of a man who had been preparing for what came next. Within weeks of taking power, he quietly discontinued the kissing ritual. No announcement was made. No explanation was offered. It simply stopped, the way things in the Soviet system tended to stop, without ceremony, as if it had never quite been official policy in the first place. The private life that ran alongside all of this public performance was, in its own way, equally complex. Victoria Petrovna, whom Brezhnev had married in 1935, was by all accounts a woman of considerable patience and considerable dignity. She had married a young party official with ambitions and a certain physical confidence, and she had watched him become, over 4 decades, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. The marriage produced 2 children and endured for the entirety of his life. Whether it remained close in any meaningful sense during its later years is something the people who knew the family have described with varying degrees of candor. The first rumors about Brezhnev's extramarital interests surfaced during his time in Kazakhstan in the 1950s, when he was overseeing the Virgin Lands campaign and operating far from Moscow's scrutiny. Those accounts are fragmentary and difficult to verify. What is better documented is what happened after he reached the top. The relationship that attracted the most sustained attention was the one involving a nurse named Nina Korovikova. The details of how they met are not fully established in the public record. What multiple sources agree on
is that the relationship lasted approximately a decade, that the age difference between them was around 30 years, and that Brezhnev's feelings were serious enough that he reportedly raised, at some point, the possibility of divorce. The response from Mikhail Suslov, the ideological guardian of the party who had survived every leadership transition since Stalin, was unambiguous. A divorce was not possible.
The General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union could not divorce his wife. The image of the Soviet family, the stable, morally serious communist household that the party held up as a model, could not absorb that kind of contradiction at its very center. Brezhnev, by the accounts of people aware of the situation, accepted this verdict without prolonged resistance. The relationship continued in the form the system permitted, private, unacknowledged, sustained by the practical arrangements that power makes possible. Victoria Petrovna maintained the public role with a composure that people who knew her described as genuine rather than performed. She attended the ceremonies, appeared in the photographs, received the foreign dignitaries' wives with the correct warmth, and kept whatever she actually felt in a place that was not accessible to the people around her. She outlived her husband by 13 years, dying in 1995, carrying whatever she knew quietly to the end. The double standard at the heart of all of this was not subtle. From the podiums of party congresses and in the pages of official publications, the Soviet leadership spoke regularly about the moral seriousness of communist family life, about the contrast between the decadent personal behavior of Western elites and the principled relationships that socialism produced. The gap between that rhetoric and the reality behind the closed doors of the Kremlin apparatus was understood at some level by a significant portion of the Soviet population. It was one of the many gaps the system required people to navigate daily, the official version and the actual version running in parallel, never quite touching. The kissing ritual and the private life were, in this sense, two expressions of the same underlying reality. Both were performances of a kind. Both required the people around Brezhnev to participate in a fiction that served his needs. Both were sustained by a system that had made the maintenance of appearances its primary function. And both pointed towards something that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s. That the man at the center of the Soviet system was not the figure the system described, and that the distance between the description and the reality was growing wider with every passing year. The people closest to that reality were carrying a weight of knowledge that had nowhere to go. And nowhere was that weight heavier or more destructive in its consequences than in the life of the person who had grown up inside the contradiction from the very beginning. Galina Brezhneva was born into a world that was already, in some fundamental sense, not quite real. Her father was a rising party official when she came into the world, and by the time she was old enough to understand what that meant, the world outside the family's privileged circle had become something she encountered only at a careful distance. The schools were better, the apartments were larger, the food was more reliable, and the invisible walls that separated the Soviet elite from the population they governed were already in place before Galina was old enough to question them. What those walls produced, in her case, was a person who had never fully learned where the limits were, because for most of her life, the limits had simply moved whenever she approached them. Her first marriage was to a circus acrobat named Yevgeny Milayev. The choice was unconventional enough to cause quiet discomfort in the circles around her father, but Brezhnev, who was not yet General Secretary, and who had his own complicated relationship with the rules that apply to other people, did not prevent it. The marriage lasted long enough to produce a son. The second, to the illusionist Igor Kio, lasted 9 days. The third, to a military officer named Yuri Cherbanov, who rose to the rank of Deputy Interior Minister in a career trajectory that owed something to his father-in-law's position, was the one that endured, at least formally, into the period when everything began to fall apart. By the time Brezhnev had consolidated his power and the family had settled into the rhythms of life at the very top of the Soviet system, Galina had developed a social world that her father's security apparatus found increasingly difficult to manage. She moved through Moscow's artistic and entertainment circles with the confidence of someone who understood that her name was a kind of permanent pass. She attended gatherings that mixed the officially celebrated with the unofficially tolerated, and eventually with people who occupied a considerably darker corner of Soviet society. The connection that would prove most consequential was with a man known as Boris Buryatsa, a Georgian circus performer who moved in circles that overlapped with the criminal underworld in ways the Soviet system officially denied existed. The relationship between Galina and Buryatsa was, by the accounts of people who observed it, one of genuine mutual affection, complicated by the fact that Buryatsa understood very clearly what Galina's name could do for him. The parties that took place at dachas connected to the Brezhnev family during this period were, according to accounts that emerged after the Soviet Union's collapse, remarkable gatherings. Senior figures from the entertainment world mixed with people whose relationship to Soviet law was, at best, flexible. The security services were aware of what was happening. The question of what to do about it, given whose daughter was at the center of it, was one that nobody in the apparatus was eager to answer. The answer arrived in 1982 in the form of a criminal investigation into the theft of diamonds and other valuables from the state circus. The investigation was not, in its origins, aimed at Galina. It targeted a network of people who had been systematically stealing from state cultural institutions and converting the proceeds through channels that led, eventually, to people connected to the Brezhnev family. Buryatsa was among those arrested. By 1982, Brezhnev's grip on the apparatus had weakened to the point where the people running the security services had their own reasons for letting the investigation proceed, and it could not be stopped even by the General Secretary himself. Brezhnev was, by multiple accounts, furious. Not at the behavior that had made the investigation possible, but at the exposure. The fury of a man who had spent his entire career managing appearances, confronted with a situation that had escaped the management entirely. Buryatsa was eventually executed. Chobanov was protected by his father-in-law's position for as long as that position held. After Brezhnev's death, the protection evaporated. Chobanov was tried, convicted of corruption, and sentenced to 12 years. Galina herself was never formally charged, but the world she had inhabited collapsed around her with a completeness that left her with very little. The name that had been a permanent pass was now a liability. She retreated into isolation, and the isolation deepened over the years into something more serious. The alcoholism that people close to her had observed for some time became the dominant fact of her existence. There were periods of psychiatric treatment, years in which she was, by the accounts of the few people who maintained contact, barely present in any meaningful sense. She died in 1998 in circumstances that attracted almost no public attention. The woman who had once moved through the highest circles of Soviet power died in near total obscurity, which was, in its own way, the most Soviet ending imaginable. Her story is not simply one of a spoiled child who made bad choices. It is a story about what happens when a system removes all natural consequences from a person's life for long enough. The privilege that surrounded her from birth was not a gift. It was a slow destruction dressed up as comfort. The private collections that Brezhnev maintained alongside his public life told a parallel story. The weapons numbered more than 300 individual pieces, ranging from standard military sidearms to historically significant items that had found their way into his possession through channels the official record does not fully document. Among them, according to accounts from people who catalogued the collection after his death, was a revolver said to have been connected to the 1918 assassination attempt on Lenin. Whether the provenance of that particular item was genuine, or the kind of romantic attribution that tends to attach itself to objects in private collections, is something that cannot be verified with confidence. The watches numbered more than 150, the most discussed being a Patek Philippe of exceptional rarity, reportedly presented by the Shah of Iran. The film library ran to approximately 1,000 titles, including a significant number of Western productions unavailable to ordinary Soviet citizens. His favorite, by the consistent account of people who knew him well, was The Magnificent Seven, the American Western from 1960. He watched it repeatedly, with an enthusiasm that people around him found both endearing and slightly puzzling. The hunting reserve at Zavidovo had been stocked over the years with animals that went considerably beyond the native fauna of the Moscow region. The art collection was assembled not according to any coherent aesthetic principle, but according to a simpler one: value. Brezhnev was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man with a developed visual sensibility. He bought what was expensive, because expensive things were what power was supposed to accumulate. All of it was kept in strict secrecy. The rooms where the collections were stored were not on any official inventory. After his death, the process of cataloguing what he had accumulated took considerable time, and the full picture emerged only gradually through the accounts of people who had been present. The double life, the public figure and the private collector, the modest Leninist and the man with 300 weapons and 1,000 films and a Patek Philippe from the Shah of Iran, was not a contradiction that Brezhnev himself seems to have experienced as troubling. The two worlds ran in parallel, and he moved between them with the ease of a man who had never been required to reconcile them. November the 10th, 1982. The date that opened this story is also the date that closes it. 18 years. That is how long Leonid Brezhnev held the Soviet Union in his particular grip, longer than anyone after Stalin, long enough to shape an entire generation's understanding of what normal looked like. The accounting of those 18 years is not simple. The economy he inherited was functional, if deeply inefficient. The oil revenues of the 1970s provided a cushion that allowed the system to avoid harder questions about what it was actually producing and why. The opportunities that decade offered, the chance to modernize, to invest in technology, to build something that could survive the eventual decline in commodity prices, were not taken. They were not taken because taking them would have required acknowledging that the current arrangement was inadequate, and the system had no mechanism for that kind of honesty. What remained when the oil revenues thinned and the structural problems could no longer be deferred was a society that had learned over 18 years to perform rather than produce. The writer Sergei Dovlatov, who lived through the Brezhnev era and wrote about it with a clarity that only distance made fully possible, described the period as one in which everyone was playing a game that everyone knew was a game, and the unspoken agreement was that no one would say so out loud. That agreement, that collective performance of belief in a system that had stopped believing in itself, was perhaps Brezhnev's most durable legacy. And yet the full picture requires the other side of the ledger. The Brezhnev years were not the terror years. Families could make plans. Children could grow up with a reasonable expectation of what their lives would contain. The nostalgia that millions of people in the former Soviet Union have expressed for that period is not simply historical amnesia. It is the memory of a time when the future felt predictable, when the rules, however absurd, were at least consistent. That is not nothing. Brezhnev died at the right moment for himself. The system he had preserved through careful inaction was already showing the fractures that would, within a decade, become irreparable. He did not live to see the consequences of the choices he had made and the choices he had refused to make. The country paid that bill later in ways that were painful and, for many people, genuinely devastating. The man himself was, in the end, something more interesting than either the propaganda portrait or the satirical caricature. He was a person of genuine appetites and genuine fears, of real political intelligence and real personal vanity, of warmth in private and coldness in public. He was, in other words, a human being, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing about him. Because the system that elevated him, that surrounded him with medals and ghost-written books and 300 weapons and 1,000 films, that allowed his daughter to destroy herself and his wife to suffer in silence, and his country to drift toward a crisis it could not see coming, that system was not built by a monster. It was built by people, sustained by people, performed daily by millions of people who understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. Because the alternative required a kind of courage the system had spent decades making very expensive. The masks Brezhnev wore were not unique to him. They were the masks the system issued to everyone in different sizes for different purposes. His were simply larger, more heavily decorated, and worn in front of more cameras. When they finally came off in that cold November, what remained was not a revelation. It was a reflection. A mirror held up to a system that had confused the performance of greatness with greatness itself, and had kept the confusion going long enough that the distinction had almost ceased to matter.